Thank you for inviting me. I was invited by Prathusta in 2003, right here in this hall. It was a packed hall, people sitting on the floor also in the back. And the topic was, where is India in the clash of civilizations? That was the topic. And after that, there was a long debate, discussion, Q&A. Some people kind of upset that I was positioning India positively in the civilizational debate because they said, it's a bad place, there's a lot of problems we have, so things like that. So others were defending. So it was a very exciting discussion right here in this hall. I think I wish there were a video of that, but there's an audio that has been put up on the net of that whole evening that happened. So it's indeed a pleasure to be back and talk about this book, which takes the same issue of civilization but in a different way. This book is basically a challenge to Western universalism. Western universalism is a term, actually it's a contradictory term, because if there is universalism, then you cannot say there is a Western universalism. Universalism would be just universalism. But I call it Western universalism on purpose to make the point that what has been considered universal often is Western philosophy, Western history, Western categories, Western methodologies. And because of the power of the West, it's considered universal, and not only by them, but also by all the other people. So we've kind of downloaded that Western thought into our own being and started functioning accordingly. So that's the thing I'm critiquing. And reversing the gaze, which means, they have been gazing at us. They've been researching us, sending scholars, sending anthropologists, religion experts, history experts, whatever, studying us, mapping us onto their own categories for a few hundred years. And therefore, the gazer has power, because the gazer is using his categories and his way of thinking and looking to look at you. So the one who is gazing gets the power of creating the discourse. And the one who is gazed at but never gazes back is actually losing power. So unfortunately, we sometimes feel proud that we are gazed at. We must be very interesting. We must be very important. I've heard people saying, we should be very glad they're gazing at us. We must be important. It shows that we are very important. But that's an inferiority complex. We need to gaze at others. For India to have a civilizational claim on the world stage, we need to have our view, our world view of ourselves and others. Sometimes I've heard some traditional swamis, gurus say, no, the truth is in my heart, so why do I need to worry about others? And then I remind them of the term Purva Paksha. Purva Paksha is gazing at others. Our term. The Vedantins and Buddhists and Mimamsa and the various branches of Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, Vishishta Advaita Vedanta, all of them engaged in Purva Paksha, which means one's knowledge about the other, one's understanding about the other, and then giving a response using one's own Siddhanta, means one's own theory, one's own perspective. So Purva Paksha, study of the other, followed by Siddhanta, one's own perspective, contrasting with the other, is a very old ancient technique in India, pioneered in India. And therefore, it's not something undharmic or un-Indian to do this reversing the gaze. It's just sad that all this Purva Paksha used to happen during the classical time, but for the last few centuries, we stopped doing it. Even today, when you go to a place where they're training acharyas for the next generation, they teach them Vedanta using the debates with Buddhists. They're teaching the Purva Paksha with the Buddhists to train. But today, the other is not Buddhist. The Buddhist is not the dominant culture like it was one time. So the debate has to be with Western. The Purva Paksha has to be with Western thought. And Western thought, the Purva Paksha is not disrespectful. Purva Paksha is not that we're knocking down people and we are, hating them or accusing them or any of that. Purva Pakshi is just to understand this is their point of view, this is their worldview, and here is our worldview. And the West is not a simple category like, Christianity. It's Judaism, Christianity, it's the Western Enlightenment movement, out of which was born secularism, Marxism, many great thinkers. And then postmodernism, post-enlightenment. So, just like a critique of Indian civilization would be not a very simple matter, because you would have to study all kinds of Indian thinkers. Similarly, in the West, you have to really do your homework. So it's partly out of laziness that our exemplars and scholars have really not bothered to do Purva Paksha, because it takes a lot of effort to understand the other side. You can't do a good Purva Paksha unless you really understand the other side. And it's partly out of maybe a complex or a fear that we should not be doing it. So this book is my Purva Paksha of the West, from an Indian point of view. That is basically what the book is about. And the cover of the book is Samudra Manthan, which is two opposing sides churning the ocean to bring creativity, to create new things. So you have one side, the Devas on the cover, and on the back is the Asuras, and in the spine is the spindle, to churn. So this book is the result of my own Samudra Manthan with many kinds of opponents over the last 20 years. I have debated Catholics and Protestants and secularists, atheists, Jewish people, or people who are postmodernists who see that there is no point in talking about difference. That is one group, one category of Samudra Manthan is with the Western. Then I found that a very easy trick for Westerners to try and stump me is to say, well, you're representing the dharmic civilization, but which dharmic civilization? There's many of them. Are you representing Buddhism, Advaita Vedanta, Sri Aurobindo? Are you representing ISKCON? Are you representing Ramakrishna Mission? Who are you representing? And they know a lot that there are these issues. So they utilize it. So then I had to do Purva Paksha within our own traditions also. So I have to be very careful if I try to define what are the critical positions of our dharmic civilization. I have to be sure that I can, if I take a position and go around talking to many different sampradayas, many different groups, they'll disagree with each other. They will not have anything to do with what somebody else said. So this internal Purva Paksha gives me something common. Then I take it to the external Purva Paksha, tell them that this is who we are. But then, if the item that's common is too generic, too loose, like there is one truth and stuff like that, then it's also not different with the other. Then they're also the same. So it's not easy to find the result of internal Purva Paksha, something common, such that the external Purva Paksha shows it to be different than the others. So it's like solving two simultaneous equations, two equations simultaneously. You have to solve a problem that satisfies both criteria. So I came up with these kind of ideas. For instance, every dharmic civilization representatives I talk to, and I talk to experts whose authority would be recognized, and many of them have endorsed. We've got 100 letters of endorsement already. I found that they would have no problem with karma and reincarnation as a central principle. And then I found that karma and reincarnation cannot be rationalized with Judeo-Christianity. Because in Judeo-Christianity, for example, the idea of original sin is the starting point. And the idea of virgin birth. Original sin, for those of you who don't know, is something Adam and Eve do, and because of which God makes a decree that all progeny meaning children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, future offspring, all progeny of Adam and Eve, forever and ever, will be condemned to eternal damnation. That's the curse. Now, this is a very important point. So therefore, everybody is a born sinner. Everybody is born sinner. This means that all of you are sinners. Me, everybody's sinner. And then God feels sorry. So He therefore sends His one Son to get sacrificed and suffer on behalf of everybody's sin, so that they don't have to suffer. You see, it's called substitutional atonement. That's the theological term in Christianity. If somebody doesn't understand what you're saying, you use a right term, they will understand it, because they can look it up. Substitutional atonement. Atonement means you have to pay for your sin. Substitutional atonement is that Jesus has already paid for your sin, so you don't have to. So now the question is, Jesus himself, if he's progeny of Adam and Eve, would be born a sinner. Would be born a sinner. Then how can he redeem others if he's born a sinner? So to prevent that from happening, he's not progeny of Adam and Eve. Therefore the virgin birth is critical. You see, the virgin birth means he's not born through a human father and human mother, and therefore he is not subject to being the progeny of Adam and Eve, and therefore he does not have the original sin in him. This is a very interesting point. Yeah. So, original sin, the very nature of original sin, and the very methodology for redeeming that original sin by having virgin birth, creates a solution to that problem which is exclusive, because this virgin birth happened only once. I wasn't born on virgin birth, we were born of normal human mother and father. So we do not have the capacity to achieve enlightenment or to achieve Tattvamasi, Aham Brahmasmi, to achieve oneness with the divine. We do not have that. We don't. And only one person was ever born who had that capacity, because he was born of virgin birth. And since God has only one Son, therefore it cannot be claimed by anyone else. And this forces us into the historicity of Jesus as the only path. And through that only can we get redemption. Now, this is very contradicted by all the dharmas. Buddhists also are convinced. ISKCON people, Ramakrishna people, all of them, Sri Aurobindo people, that we have innate in us the capacity for enlightenment. Every human being has, and therefore there can be many of them. Buddhists do not believe that Buddha was the only, that Buddha's history was important. Buddha's history is not important for you to achieve the same state that Buddha achieved. Buddha's history is good to know, to learn. It's like if you are a physicist, then the historicity of Newton is not relevant to Newtonian laws. Because you cannot say there was no Newtonian law and he came and started the Newtonian law, and if you don't believe in him, the Newtonian law will not work for you. You cannot say, you don't say that. So, but this business of, so we are not, our tradition does not demand a particular history be valid and exclusively valid and invalidate all alternative ideas of history for the truth. We do not have that. And the nature of the human being is such that everybody is Satchitanand. Everybody has that potential of that divinity that they can realize. And so the question I ask my Christian friends is, can you be Jesus? Can you attain Jesushood? And they say no. Now for us, if you ask a Buddhist, can you be like Buddha? He says yes. That is the whole point. This is true for all our different traditions, despite their nuances and differences. But no one of them claim exclusivity. No one of them claim a historicity. No one of them claim that we are fallen sinners. That sort of thing. Yeah. So this is, I came up with 4 important differences between the Indian civilization, the classical Indian civilization, and the Western civilization, and each of them is given a separate chapter in this book. And one of the points I make is, Christians have this idea called the good news, when I meet these Christians sometimes who are practicing in my neighborhood, they're practicing how to evangelize before they're sent to India or some place like that. They first have to go in the neighborhood and practice, you see. And then when they're good, then they can be sent overseas. So some of them knock at my door sometimes, and I always pretend like I don't know much, you know, and bring them in, and then they talk nicely. Some of them ask, you know, have you heard the good news, sir? And I say, oh, what good news, you know? Did the stock market go up? Or what is this good news? And I, of course, know good news is that Jesus has come to redeem your sins. So after a while they say, but, you know, have you been saved? And my answer is, I was never condemned to begin with. And you seem like decent people. I don't think you've done anything wrong. I don't know. I don't think you've done anything wrong. So they don't know what to do with a guy like this, because I don't fit their the standard training they've got in the seminary, how to answer questions. This is something different. So then they tell me about, you know, we're all sinners, and then I say, why are we sinners? What? So because I want them to talk about original sin. I want to pretend like I don't know. I want their reasoning to go into original sin. So then they say, you know, because of this original sin, and then I say, okay, what is this original sin? How do you know what is this? So then they tell me this happened, so we're all condemned, and only Jesus is not original sinner, and we have to be saved through him, like that. So then I get a chance to talk about our concept of self, because while the concept of self is that ultimately the essence of each person is sinner. That is the very ultimate nature of the person. That is, and therefore you are dependent on this historicity to save yourself. So then I asked them, do you know the Hindu good news? So they don't know, they never heard of that. So I say, Hindu good news is there's no original sin, we are all originally divine. And that way I can explain the idea of Satchitanand. And this idea is just different. They have internal logic and consistency in this history centrism. So my thesis on that the Western religions are history centric is accepted by their theologians. This is interesting. To be a valid Purva Paksha, I cannot insinuate what they don't accept. You see? So I have a 2-hour taped interview in this month in Delhi with Mark Tully, who you know is a BBC correspondent and lover of India and loves our traditions and all that. And in the beginning of the interview, he says he's an Anglican Christian and wants to remain that way. And he says, I tell him that he starts by saying, why talk about difference? Why don't we talk about how we are the same? So I said, well, same as you become same as me, or does same mean that I become same as you? So then I gave him this whole thing about, is it the Christian good news that I should become same, or the Hindu good news you become same? So are you willing to accept Satchitanand? And therefore, if you are, let me warn you what the consequences are. The consequences are the historicity becomes unimportant. You can have good feelings about Jesus. I have good feelings about Jesus, no problem. I think he's a great guy. But I cannot say that there is an exclusivity in him. I cannot say that. That was a power structure of the church. So if you separate Jesus from the Christianity started by Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, Christianity was not started by Jesus. He never even used the term Christianity, and he never said, please start a church. He never did that. 4th century after Jesus was the start of Christianity by the Roman emperor, who wanted to have a monotheism as a way to unify people and make them all behind, the church, and he became the head of that. So this is how the Christianity starts. Is a kind of a ruling emperor, military rulers, a kind of imperialist ideology. That's how it starts. It's not start with Jesus at all. So I keep discussing with Mark Tully, do we use your idea of sameness, so I have to be the same as you, in which case I can't be Satchitanand. I have to start with the premise of original sin. Or do you want to be same as me? And why not respect both? Why not have mutual respect? Because the moment you say we must be same, one or the other is going to get compromised.
Yeah.
So whereas if we say we celebrate diversity, after all, in nature there's so much diversity. And there's so many kinds of plants and trees. And even within one plant like mango, there'll be many varieties of mangoes. And so within animals, there'll be dogs, and then many varieties of dogs. And even within humans, as DNA-wise, everybody is different. So if you keep going, in Buddha, one of the sermons of Buddha, he is talking about worlds within worlds within worlds. That is the nature of reality, somebody asks him. So that there's so many realms, so many contexts within contexts. And then one guy asks him, how many such worlds are there, sir? Now there's innumerable, of course, context, different varieties. So his answer is very beautiful. He says there is as many worlds as there are grains of sand in the river Ganga. So you can imagine if you just take one pinch of sand, it'll have a million of grains. So you can imagine on the river Ganga how many grains of sand. So they were having this discussion on the river. So he says as many as there are grains of sand on the river Ganga. Quite an astounding point, that it is not one homogeneous context in which everything must exist. So our tradition, because the one has manifest as trillions and trillions and trillions. Therefore this diversity is inherent. And therefore there's many different ideas also, many different cultures also. So we respect each other. And there is no reason to be wanting to be same. Sameness is either from superiority or inferiority. Superiority, sameness leads to the trouble that I am right and I want you to accept that. It has led to genocides, if you look at history. It has led to slavery, because I cannot put up with you being different in some way. Maybe your color, maybe your race, maybe your language is different, so I'm going to slave you because you're not like me. I can take advantage of that. It has led to big evangelical programs to convert everybody. And then the idea of sameness from inferiority complex, which a lot of Indians suffer, has led to mimicking others and forgetting a sense of who you are, which we're losing a sense of who we are. So this sameness is a problem, and it is contrary to the nature of the cosmos. It is contrary to that. So the purpose of this book is to show that we can be different without disrespecting anybody, but we must go deep into the Purva Paksha of the other in order to appreciate where they're coming from, what is distinct about them, and to give a response using our own Siddhanta. So we must know the Purva Paksha of the other, we must know our Siddhanta, we must know both sides, and we must be able to then do this comparative and with respect. That's what the purpose of this book is. Yeah? And this is what I call an Indian challenge to Western universalism. That I do not accept Western universalism as the only way, the only path, and so on and so forth. Yeah? So these, I won't go into the details of all the four differences. I explain one difference. I use, in that case, in the difference I talked about the uniqueness of history of Jesus, I use the term history centrism. History centrism, which is in chapter 2, is the claim that that only through history you can access the ultimate truth, and not through any sadhana, any enlightenment, any capacity in you, because you're a sinner. You cannot figure it out on your own. You can never know the truth, the ultimate truth, because you are a sinner. Because I even ask people that, okay, Gandhi, this is a question raised in the Vatican discussion. Was Gandhi, who never accepted Jesus, did he go to heaven or hell? This is an important point. It's a big quandary. Because if Gandhi could have gone to heaven, if the Vatican would declare, then it means that they lost the whole exclusivity. Then the whole structure would crumble. It means that we have it in us as humans, our potential to live a certain kind of lifestyle, and without depending on a particular historicity of a particular man. So after much debate, this is published. The conclusion accepted was that Gandhi could not have gone to heaven because he did not accept Jesus. And you know, in a binary system, there's no reincarnation there in that system. So if you don't go to heaven, you know where you go. Okay. So I call this history centrism. This particular mental makeup, history centrism. History centrism, metaphysically, comes from infinite gap between God and man, infinite gap. Man as a fallen sinner has no capacity to move upward and bridge the gap. And God only can once in a while send a prophet to give you instructions. So it's like they can send you release 1.0, then they can send you release 2.0, then they can send you release 3.0. But you cannot create a release, or you cannot access the release. It's only when a release is sent, you can accept it.
No open source.
There is not open source. Yeah. In fact, I mentioned that. I have an appendix or like that, something like that. I have an appendix here which talks about this. The appendix, a lot of people don't read, and so yeah, you should read that. Appendix is the integral unity of Dharma. Appendix A, that I do a comparison with Buddhism and all. And then Appendix B is a systems model of Dharma and Abrahamic traditions. So I say that the Abrahamic traditions are like release 1, release 2, release 3. So release 1, Jews are given a solution. Only Jews. Release 1 is only installed by a certain group of people. The others don't have the hardware to install it. So Jews are given a solution if they follow the rules. Then God feels sorry, so send release 2, which is that Jesus will come and he'll suffer for everybody. Substitutional atonement. And then everybody who accepts that is able to get out of sin. So that's release 2. Now there's many versions of 2 because there's 2.1, which is the Catholic version, 2.2 Protestant. 2.3 is Mormon. Mormons have a very interesting idea. Mormons believe in the 19th century, a man was born in US. Yeah. And he had a dream, God telling him, that you go to a certain place, dig, and you will discover tablets of gold on which I've written all my, the release source code is written there. And you should write it down and hide the tablets of gold there. And that place is near Ithaca, near Cornell University. You go there and you can see it in the forest, they'll tell you. And the Mormons have bought that land, So nobody can come and do archaeological survey to see if there is gold tablets. And the Mormon Bible, which is hundreds of pages, each page used to be a gold tablet. So there must be a huge supply of gold in there. So this guy writes it down, and that becomes the first prophet. They say he's the prophet. So a new release was given only to the Mormons. That's the basis of the Mormon church. They accept the prior releases. They don't say it's a virus. They don't say they say it's not the latest. This is the latest. So it is the earlier prophets are valid, but this is more recent. That's why Christians are people who accept release 1, they accept Judaism. They accept Judaism. All the Jewish prophets are listed. But they are saying that Jesus comes and supersedes all that. The Jews cannot accept Jesus as release 2 because then they are obsolete. You see, the person who's supplying release 2 can accept the previous releases, but not vice versa. Because if that person accepted there's a superseding release, then why is he around? Why do you need it? So this is a problem. Then comes release 3.0, that is Islam, which is another prophet, who comes and says that the previous release are valid, but they got corrupted. So God gives new instructions. And this is the final. There is no more release, no more final. That's it. Now the problem with this is that, first of all, if Jesus had virgin birth and he is Son of God, which is necessary condition for Christianity, it's not something just, we people in India think it's just a metaphorical significance. It is philosophical, theological, mandatory to solve original sin, he has to be virgin birth and he has to be son of God and there has to be this crucifixion. So, if all that did happen, then an ordinary human prophet, and Muhammad is considered an ordinary human prophet. No virgin birth, he is not God, he is not son of God, he is not avatar. The Muslims will tell you that. They do not accept any of those interpretations. He's an ordinary human being who heard God's message, God giving him release 3.0 and saying, please distribute it. So his job is to just distribute the release. His job is not that he is God or anything like that. And this is the definition of prophet. But the question is, what is the status of Jesus in Islam? The status of Jesus in Islam is very interesting. Jesus is a very great prophet. And the previous release he brought is a good release. But Jesus is not Son of God. He is not Son of God. Because Son of God could not be superseded by ordinary human prophet. So he is downgraded to being an ordinary human prophet. Yeah? But in Christianity, you go to a Christian, you ask a Muslim scholar, I'm not talking politically, I'm saying real philosophers and theologians, you ask them, you respect Jesus as a great man, great teachings, and we learn from him. Do you accept him as Son of God? And he will say no. He will say no. This is how Purva Paksha has to be done. We have to be very accurate. And then you take this view to the Christian, and you say that there are people who respect Jesus, even I respect Jesus, but not as Son of God. Do you accept that position? No. So you have two history centrisms that are mutually incompatible. This is the result of history centrism. Whereas to us, all these things could have happened. We are open source. We can accommodate them. But we don't consider any of this to be unique. We can have Sri Ramakrishna also. We can have Ramana Maharshi also. We can have you, me, enlightened beings, many of them. And therefore, we are not in a box. Now, before I close, there's also in Islam a release 3.1. And that is the Ahmadiyyas. I don't know how many of you know. Can you, with a show of hand, you know who Ahmadiyyas are? Okay, some of you know that. Ahmadiyyas, like the Mormons, believe in the previous history of the faith, but it was superseded by a new prophet who was born in Lahore. Now, this is a very big problem for Muslims because if it goes into the control of Lahore, then gosh, what will happen to Makkah? Yeah. So it's also a political issue. Some now they are trying to spread that one Makkah idea. You have to point there to pray. Now it is to be spread out and globalized. But some guy, one of the former colonies has the latest prophet, and the release 3.0 has to come from that guy. Is pretty bad news. So the Ahmadiyya prophet, he accepted prior prophets. Ironically, he also accepted Ram. It's very interesting. Yeah, discussion. So my knowledge is from the source. I'm not making up something. You know, I talk to them very seriously. So they told me that their prophet, he accepted the prior Jewish Christian prophet and Prophet Muhammad, but he also accepted Ram. And but he's the latest. So he's 3.1. That's the latest. So there's about 20 million Ahmadiyyas in the world, a lot of them in India. In Pakistan, they're persecuted.
What about Shias?
Now, Shias, different case I'll come to. The issue is, you know, in the Pakistan passport of my friends who are Ahmadiyyas, I don't know if you know this, it's stamped that I am an Ahmadiyya and I hereby declare I am not conforming with Islam and I'm not entitled to being called a Muslim. In other words, if you practice Ahmadiyya, you better not call yourself a Muslim. You are a heretic. Heretic means somebody who's non-Muslim. According to them, an infidel. This is in the passport of every Ahmadiyya who's a Pakistani citizen. And if you don't believe me, you go to the Pakistani embassy website in USA. I don't know if it's true elsewhere. If you are applying for a visa to Pakistan and you download the form, in some article I wrote on Suleikha, I quoted this. In the Pakistan government visa form, if you declare yourself Ahmadiyya, they ask you, then you have to swear by signing that as Ahmadiyya, I declare I'm not qualified to call myself a Muslim. So this 3.1 is a kind of a virus for them. It is.
In an Institute of Science, they should all know that Abdus Salam was an Ahmadi.
Ah, okay, good.
The Nobel Prize.
Yeah,
Nobel Prize.
yeah. So this is a contradiction, you know, that there are great people, but the institutional authority of the imams don't accept this as a valid release. So the history centrism has an internal problem. Forget problem with us. Internal problem is that it's a chronological linear sequence of releases, and the later release always wins. Because the later release can respect all the previous ones, but downgrade them so that it can supersede. And the previous releases cannot accept the later one because otherwise they're obsolete. It's like if somebody declared, you know, Windows 8 or something. Then Microsoft would have to say it's bogus because otherwise they're out of business. Yeah. They're out of business. See? So, especially with somebody they don't control. If somebody from somewhere says, I got Windows 8. So this is a very, whereas the guy who's selling Windows 8, he can respect Windows 7. Yeah. He can say it was good release, very nice, I respect them, but I got something new. So this is the box of history centrism. And in contrast, I explain in that chapter, I'm discussing only one chapter, this chapter 2, that's all I'm discussing, because there's so many things in every chapter. So, in contrast to all that, we have a concept of which we call the embodied knowing. The human being embodies the releases that he needs. The human being, each of us has got these releases. It's like in your system already the hard drive came with all the releases in it. And you just have to have the key to decode it and activate it. So this sort of enlightenment that the human can achieve through various sadhanas, giving him higher and higher understanding, because as he gets higher understanding and higher insight by his own sadhana, then accordingly he can handle more and more sophisticated releases. You know, he has to be prepared for all that understanding. So we do not depend on a historical thing. We do not depend on some release from outside coming to us. We are not required to depend on any institution. You know, when a mystic in India proclaims that he's achieved a certain state of enlightenment, people love that guy, they go to him, they flock around him. But in the Abrahamic religions, mystics were considered to be a threat, because the mystic is a threat to the institution's power. Because people will abandon the institution, they go to the mystic, and the mystic may supersede, may say anything that contradicts the institution. So this embodied knowing, or what we call Adhyatma Vidya, as I describe in this book, has many diversities. It is not like all the dharma traditions are one either. They're not homogeneous. Because I may have achieved, through my practice, I may have achieved a certain state of consciousness, I start teaching that, somebody else achieved something else, they teach that. That's fine, because, you know, I have no right to say that he did not achieve that state. I don't know. How can I can just say I don't know.